Dear friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 22nd edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. Please join our Newsbud community, become a member, and support our work. Support independent media. Now, let's find out what is going on in Russia based on the front page stories in the major Russian newspapers. Today, we'll begin with the front page of Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for February 28, 2017. So, let's find out what the Kremlin priorities are at this time. On the entire front page, there's an article entitled "The New Abduction of Europe." The reference is, of course, to ancient Greek mythology and to Zeus's abduction and ravishment of a Cretan woman whose name was Europa. In this article, however, the reference is geopolitical rather than mythological. The article is an interview with the German geopolitical specialist Alexander Rar, the director of the German-Russian Forum, and the reference is to what NATO and the powerful segments of the US foreign policy establishment are doing to Europe at this time. The article is accompanied by a color photograph of Alexander Rar. Let's examine more closely what Rar said in this interview, because that is obviously something that the key people in the Kremlin, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin, agree with. Otherwise, the interview would not be given such a prominence on the front page of the Russian government-owned newspaper. Rar stated that Germany had found itself in a very difficult position after the Brexit and the victory of Donald Trump in the United States. On the one hand, Germany entered a serious conflict with Russia on the basis of what the Germans see as a conflict of values and political philosophies. The German elite sees Russia as inspiring and leading a conservative populist renaissance in Europe, which threatens the foundations of the neoliberal German and European establishments. Most German politicians also see the US President Donald Trump as coming from the same ideological milieu. According to Rar, the German political elite has become confused and disoriented by the apparent lack of support from Washington, on which it had depended for decades. At the same time, the power of alternative, non-neoliberal, anti-globalist political forces in Germany and all across Europe is growing. The liberal elite really does not know how to deal with them, and so there is a lot of anxiety at the top. However, Rar said that over the years, the ideological liberal monopoly had been formed in Germany and in Europe more generally, combining the political elite, the media, the leaders of the corporate world, and this extremely powerful and wealthy group did not plan to give up its privileges and reins of power so easily. According to Rar, they will try to fight off any efforts for political change, even to the point of conspiring against both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Rar stated that Germany, and especially the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, if she got re-elected in September 2017, was ready to assume the leadership of this neoliberal European group, even to the point of advocating the formation of a separate European army. He thought that other European countries, particularly the ones from East Central Europe, were willing to accept the German leadership in their growing confrontation with Russia, because they believed that only Germany had enough economic power to build up a strong military without the assistance of the United States. However, at the same time, Merkel lost quite a lot of popularity in Europe when her comments, instead of resolving, exacerbated the 2015 migrant crisis. According to Rar, the public sentiments and the public statements of both the US Vice President Michael Pence and the US Secretary of Defense James Mattis demonstrated that the US would expect the European countries to make greater financial contributions to their defense budgets and NATO in general. The US does not want to pay so much for the European defense anymore. Rar thought that the main focus of the US foreign policy in the coming period would be Asia, and that the United States military investments would be directed to the US allies there and not in Europe. In my opinion, however, Rar seems to assume that the US foreign policy establishment did not see Russia as a threat anymore, which I think is too much premature to say. Rar dismissed the possibility that Germany and the EU could develop an alliance with China in order to confront and subvert the attempts by the US President Donald Trump to change the rules of international trade. According to him, for this alliance to be successful, Germany and the EU would have to drop the imposition of liberal political principles as their foreign policy priority. However, these principles represent the core identity of the present German and EU political elite. They still do not want to admit that their neoliberal project has failed and that we already live in the post-liberal world, or as the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov put it, we live in the post-Western world. Rar stated that the German leadership was willing to increase the annual defense budget in order to remain in the good graces of the Trump administration. Germany took the side of the Ukrainian government in the present conflict there and is now afraid that if Trump and Putin made a deal over Ukraine, it would be left on the losing side after having spent already hundreds of millions of euros in the anti-Russian and anti-Putin efforts. However, it is not clear where the additional 60 billion euros for the German military would come from. In my opinion, this could easily become one of the most contentious issues in the coming parliamentary elections. With regard to these elections, Rar did not think that any radical changes in the makeup of the German political leadership would take place. He said that this might happen in France and Italy, but not in Germany, for at least another 5 years, due to the legacy of the post-World War II political changes and institutional arrangements. The political scene in Germany is much less flexible than in other European countries. In addressing the issue of anti-Russian sanctions, Rar stated that they would most likely be kept in place. According to him, the sanctions go much beyond the Ukrainian question and the Minsk Accords. They represent a geopolitical tool designed to pressure Russia into submitting, just like in the 1990s, and accepting the tutelage and the political values of the EU. This clearly will not happen under Putin, and so the sanctions will continue. Rar stated that he was afraid that the rift between the EU and Russia would only grow in the future, and that only some kind of a big political event or even a catastrophe, which would require the collaborative efforts of both the EU and Russia, could bring the two closer together again. In my opinion, Rar's statements were given such a prominence in this edition of Rossiyskaya Gazeta because he, as a well-known German political analyst, placed the blame for the decline in the EU-Russia relations squarely on the side of Germany and the EU. It was their neoliberal ideological offensive, masking geopolitical aims, that led to the current tensions, according to Rar. And now, instead of making amends, it appears that Germany and the EU plan to pursue the same strategy by using military means. Both Rar and the Russian political elites think that this is futile and foolish. The neoliberal paradigm has lost, and we live in the post-Western world. However, the failing EU and German neoliberal political class will persist to cling to power, and this may lead to serious, violent incidents and a variety of crises in Europe in the coming years. Now, we'll go to the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for February 27, 2017. On the bottom of the front page, on the far right, there is an article with a curious title: Denmark reaches for the territory of Germany. The subtitle explains that for the first time in history, there seems to be a brewing territorial dispute between NATO member states. The article reports that the opposition, right populist, Danish People's Party, is demanding the return of the southern Schleswig region, which is now under the jurisdiction of Germany. It states that at this time, there is just a slight concern in Berlin about this issue. The article adds sarcastically that so far, nobody alleged the Russian interference in this matter. According to the article, the vice president of the Danish People's Party, Søren Espersen, recently said that his party would want to have the territory of Denmark extended to the river Eider. This river flows through the middle of the German federal state of Schleswig-Holstein. This means that Denmark would take over the towns of Flensburg, Schleswig, and Rendsburg, as well as the island of Sylt in the North Sea. The article sarcastically states that this is more of an open threat to Germany and the German territorial integrity than anything that would come from Russia, and that therefore the German tanks may be more useful here than on the border of Lithuania and the Kaliningrad region. The article notes that Espersen is far from being a marginal figure in Danish politics. His party is the second largest in the Danish parliament, and without their support, the current government of the Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen would collapse. And the party also has deputies in the European Parliament, which enables it to internationalize this issue. This means that the territorial dispute will not only not go away, but will intensify as time goes by. In fact, Espersen himself stated that there was nothing like static borders in European history. Historically speaking, the Schleswig-Holstein region has been a site of serious conflict between Denmark and Germany, that is Prussia. Prussia took it over after the War of 1864, but its status was finally decided after World War I, when it was divided between Denmark and Germany. Though the article claims that this is the first open border dispute between NATO member states, there are many more in Europe. The most prominent one is between Great Britain and Spain over Gibraltar. There are some in Eastern Europe as well, where the best known recent one is over the maritime border between Slovenia and Croatia. This means that the NATO alliance is not as internally coherent as it seeks to present itself in the media. It has always been a surprise to me why the NATO opponents have not done more to publicize and amplify these disputes, and thus shed light on serious NATO vulnerabilities. But as this article demonstrates, that is clearly changing, and the major Russian media will no doubt lead the effort. Now, let's go to the front page of Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for February 22nd, 2017. On the bottom of the front page, on the left, there is an article entitled Transnistria, a seceded pro-Russian part of Moldova, is for the first time ready to discuss its status with Moldova. The subtitle explains that the officials in Tiraspol, which is the capital of Transnistria, believe that Moldova should hold a referendum on the Transnistrian status. The article reports that for the first time in many years, the officials of Transnistria seem to be ready to negotiate about the status of their self-proclaimed republic. The only condition they insisted on was holding a referendum in Moldova. At the same time, the officials in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, said that the special political status for Transnistria could be considered. This was recently stated by both the pro-Russian president, Igor Dodon, and the pro-NATO prime minister, Pavel Filip. The article points out that the president of Transnistria also appears to have changed his political position, because not so long ago he advocated the full-blown independence for the self-proclaimed republic. According to the head of the Transnistrian parliament, Alexander Rar, the Transnistrian officials would accept negotiating with Moldova if the initiative came from the Moldovan parliament. He stated that Transnistria organized referendum in 2006, in which the vast majority voted for independence and potential future integration into the Russian Federation. If the Moldovan government is serious about taking steps toward the resolution of the existing problems, it should also organize a similar referendum in Moldova. Sherba emphasized that the Moldovan parliament should be in the forefront of such an initiative. According to the article, Russia has long been involved in trying to resolve the Moldova-Transnistria dispute within the 5+2 international group, consisting of Moldova, Transnistria, Russia, Ukraine, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the observers from the EU and the US. The Russian parliamentary deputy, Leonid Kalashnikov, who is the chairman of the Commonwealth of Independent States Committee in the Duma, stated that with the election of Igor Dodon, Moldova obtained a real chance to work with Transnistria to overcome the present divisions, because both sides were now oriented toward Moscow. However, Kalashnikov wondered to what extent Dodon would be able to implement his ideas, considering the opposition from the pro-NATO Prime Minister Filip. In my opinion, this is a very good question. The same geopolitical forces active in Moldova today led to the 2014 coup d'etat and civil war in Ukraine. Would they try to do something similar in Moldova? Would Moldova be turned into another war zone in Eastern Europe? Especially now that one of the executive leaders, the president of the country, Igor Dodon, represents an alternative geopolitical orientation and has a lot of popular support. It seems to me that before any serious work on the resolution of the Moldova-Transnistria dispute could begin, new parliamentary elections in Moldova would need to be held in order to ascertain what the majority of the Moldovan people see as the key political priorities at this time. However, could we really expect that NATO strategists would let Moldova go without a fight? I hope they learned their lesson in Ukraine, but considering the recent dramatic increase of NATO troops in the Baltic states and Poland, and the false narratives propagated by the NATO-controlled European media, this is far, far from certain. Now, let's go to one of the major pro-communist newspapers in Russia, Sovietskaya Rossiya, the edition for February 28, 2017. On the front page, there is an article discussing the celebrations of the Day of the Fatherland's Defenders on February 23rd, which in the past was celebrated as the Day of the Soviet Army and Navy. The title is Strengthen the Military, Protect Russia. Right below the title, there is a photograph of a group of the Communist Party members, including the officers in uniform, from the Siberian city of Chelyabinsk, in front of the monument to the soldiers and civilians who lost their lives in World War II. The article states that the Communist Party of Russia organized many events all across the country to celebrate this national holiday. These events included marches, demonstrations, protest walks, lectures, and concerts. The emphasis of the Communist Party members and sympathizers was on giving their full support to the Russian armed forces and criticizing the Russian government for not doing enough for the military. According to the article, the communist-led protest walk in Moscow was one of the largest in many years. Some of the slogans at the protests were, "Our aim is the federation of brotherly nations." The reference here was, of course, to the former nations of the Soviet Union. Also, the slogan, "We demand that the government respect the law on military pensions." And the slogan, "Yes to the recognition of the People's Republics in the Donbass." In fact, at some of the events, the speakers were either the military volunteers who fought in the Donbass against the Ukrainian army, or those who delivered the humanitarian aid there. The content of the speeches was intensively nationalistic and everywhere the same. Russia must do more to defend the Donbass from the Kiev government, including granting it formal recognition as a political entity separate from Ukraine. Another constant of the protests and marches was the strong anti-government sentiment. The Medvedev government was accused of cutting social services and pensions and of not paying enough attention to the needs of the military personnel. Much more investment in the military industry was demanded. In addition, the government was criticized for not being determined and forceful enough to expand the Russian influence in international affairs. In fact, there were numerous calls for the outright resignation of the Medvedev government. And so, we are faced with a situation that the Western mass media hides from their domestic audiences. It's being hidden from us. Whereas the Western media, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, CNN, and BBC, represent Putin and his regime as the main threat to the West the examination of the actual Russian political reality shows that the strongest Russian opposition party, the Communist Party, is much more assertive towards the West than Putin. It is therefore not clear what the Western establishment politicians really want. Their attempts to destabilize Putin will not lead to democracy in Russia, as they claim, but will directly aid the communists coming to power again. And with the communists, the geopolitical plans to revive the old Soviet Empire and expand its reach into East Central Europe will really come into being. Is that what the NATO militarist clique truly wants, so that it can build up its own war apparatus again, just like during the US-Soviet Cold War? Is that the real name of the game? The enemy of my enemy is my friend? It remains to be seen. But one thing is already certain. The only losers in such a cynical political game would be the ordinary people in Russia and in Europe, just like in all earlier European wars. Lastly, today, let's look at the Russian semi-tabloid press, the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, the edition for February 22nd, 2017. On the front page, there is a big color photograph of the late Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin, walking out during the meeting of the UN General Assembly. The title of the article is Pure Sensationalism. American journalists might have brought about the death of Vitaly Churkin. The subtitle explains that this is the version explored by the New York correspondent of the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda. According to the article, during the last few days of his life, Vitaly Churkin spoke several times with great anger about an article published by the internet news site BuzzFeed. The article describes BuzzFeed as a site without a great deal of journalistic authority and credibility, but with a large mass audience in the United States and beyond. The BuzzFeed article in question was written by Ali Watkins and published on February 15th. The title of the article was "The Strange Case of the Russian Diplomat Who Got His Head Smashed In on Election Day." And he talked about the sudden death of Sergei Crevo, who worked in the Russian consulate in New York City, and linked it to the alleged Russian interference into the US presidential elections. Crevo was described as a guard officer in the consulate. The Komsomolskaya Pravda article sets out to dispute the version of the circumstances of Crevo's death presented by BuzzFeed. According to the article, BuzzFeed built its case on the following three mistaken assumptions. The first assumption was that since Crevo was a key guard officer at the consulate, he had access to the consulate secure room used by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, SVR, to send top-secret cables to Moscow. The second assumption was that no Sergei Crevo could be found as a registered resident of New York City, hinting at the possibility that he was a spy. And the third assumption was that no airline admitted to transporting a coffin with the deceased to Russia in the time period after Crevo's death. According to the article, BuzzFeed's so-called mysterious circumstances are no mysteries at all. Crevo's body was cremated and his ashes were transported to Russia in an urn by his wife. Also, he was found dead early in the morning of November 8th, when it was still far from clear who would win the presidential election. Moreover, regarding the SVR, it seems more logical for the SVR to use the premises of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. for a secure transmission room, rather than the building of the consulate in New York City. In addition, in New York City, there are in fact two Russian government missions, one at the consulate and the other at the UN. Why would the consulate mission be more important for the SVR than the mission at the UN? In other words, according to Komsomolskaya Pravda, the BuzzFeed article is full of imaginative constructions, but does not contain any evidence or even plausible argumentation that Crevo's death had anything to do with the presidential elections or the alleged Russian spying. The article reports that it was therefore not surprising that Churkin reacted very negatively to the article, and that the egregious falsity of the article very likely had an impact on the state of his health. For years, Churkin had been on the diplomatic front lines of defending Russia from the cynical and unfair attacks by the West. And perhaps this was the final straw that precipitated the fatal heart attack. In my opinion, the fact that this sensationalist article was put on the front page of the newspaper, read by hundreds of thousands of Russians, demonstrates that the US corporate mass media is being presented as the main culprit behind the tsunami of the anti-Russian and anti-Putin sentiment in the United States. It is very interesting that these very same media organizations, such as BuzzFeed, are also trying to bring down the US President Donald Trump, and that as a result, he called them the enemies of the American people. This trend of the US media attacks on Trump and the Russians will no doubt continue, and the stakes will be very high. Considering that Vitaly Churkin was one of the most popular diplomatic figures in Russia, linking the US mass media to his death will exponentially amplify the already strong hostility that the Russian public feels towards it. BuzzFeed, CNN, New York Times, NBC, and others will in this way be framed not only as the enemies of the American people, but as the enemies of the Russian people as well. Dear friends, this is all for today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting Newsbud. Be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.